Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
The war in Ukraine and how Africa surprised the West. On March 20th, Russian President Putin met with Chinese President Xi in Moscow. But while the U.S. and its European partners watched and worried about the meeting with Xi, Putin was busy shuttling between that meeting and a conference of the representatives from more than 40 African countries. The conference was called Russia-Africa in a Multipolar World. Moscow was bristling that day with the signs of a changing multipolar world. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So this article continues. The African response to the war in Ukraine surprised the U.S. and Europe. Not one country in Africa has joined the U.S.-led sanctions on Russia, and the dominant stance of the continent has been neutrality. The U.S. and its European allies expected strong support from Africa and strong condemnation of Russia. Instead, they got neutrality from most, a lack of condemnation of Russia from many, and the blame being placed on the U.S. and NATO by several. Dr. Horne, they were expecting capitulation and didn't get it. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, this is one reason amongst many why we need a systematic purge, not only of the U.S. State Department, but their equivalents in the North Atlantic community. I found it ironic that when Vice President Harris landed in Africa only recently, that as the China Daily pointed out at the time of her arrival, that the airport she landed in, Accra, Ghana, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Lusaka, Zambia, were all partially or wholly built and or designed by Chinese interests. And yet, she was there supposedly to warn these Africans about the pernicious nature of the People's Republic of China and its close ally in Moscow. And of course, being polite, tactful, and diplomatic, they listened courteously, but certainly they do not plan to follow her misguided lead. And as well, Africans have more reason than most to be quite suspicious of the North Atlantic countries. After all, they remember the African slave trade. I found it interesting as well that Vice President Harris went to the Cape Coast Castle in Ghana, where enslaved Africans were shipped westward across the Atlantic to an uncertain fate under slavery, and she shed a tear as she stood there. Well, she should have been shedding a tear about what happened to independent Ghana when in 1966, the U.S. CIA was involved in the overthrow of the regime led by founding father Kwame Nkrumah with the assistance of the U.S. ambassador Franklin Williams, a former NAACP official. She should have been shedding a tear about what the U.S. CIA did in the early 1960s with regard to the liquidation of the founding father of what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Speaking of Patrice Lumumba, the U.S. authorities were so audacious that the CIA chief who was involved in that dastardly act, speaking of Larry Devlin, not Devil, actually wrote a book boasting about the fact that he had Lumumba's blood on his hand. She should have shed a tear about what happened in pre-1994 South Africa, when the United States was one of the chief allies of apartheid South Africa, complicit in the jailing of founding father Nelson Mandela. Once again, the CIA had its fingerprints all over that. She should have shed a tear about what happened in Namibia, South Africa's northern neighbor, whereby when South Africa was illegally occupying this land, which is in territorial size bigger than California and Texas combined, that illegal apartheid occupation was co-signed by U.S. imperialism. She should have shed a tear about pre-1980 Zimbabwe, that is to say pre-1980 independent Zimbabwe, whereby you had thousands of U.S. mercenaries, Euro-Americans, of course, who went to shed blood, oftentimes gave their lives to preserve a regime in Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia, which in many ways was worse, believe it or not, than apartheid South Africa. So how these diplomats, so-called, could be surprised by the fact that the Africans would not stand with these North Atlantic pirates in their latest crusade, it boggles the mind. It baffles me altogether.
It also seems like the U.S. first started off, if you remember, I mean, I think it was Gregory Meek's bill, that was the countering Russian malign activity in Africa. And that was, do what we tell you or you'll be punished. Do what we tell you or you'll be sanctioned. They were going to Africa. They were making threats. If you remember, the same Kamala Harris was at the meeting in Europe where she said, you know, you're either with us against us. So they started off by threatening Africa, and the Africans said no. And now it's a charm offensive. It's equivalently coming up saying, do what I want you to do or I'll kill you. And if you say no, oh, okay, well, then I'll give you some ice cream if you do it. You're the same person. And it just seems like now they're trying a little bit of a charm offensive because the threats didn't work. Maybe I'm wrong. Your thoughts on all of that?
Well, certainly the threats did not work because I don't think that these North Atlantic countries are aware of the changing correlation of forces globally. Not only de-dollarization, the movement away from the U.S. dollar as a mechanism for trade, even trade between non-U.S. countries, say trade in oil between China and Saudi Arabia, they're not aware, I guess, of the implications of what President Xi said as he was departing Moscow a few days ago, when he said that in train, in store, were changes on the world scene that this small planet had not seen in a century. And as he said, those changes were being driven by Moscow and Beijing. And I don't think that they realize that given that changing shift in the correlation of forces, this is not 1966. They cannot run roughshod over African nations. If you look at Algeria, for example, on the northern coast of Africa, we all recall the bitter independence war culminating with independence in 1962. And we also know that Algiers took a lot of flack post-independence for hosting the international section of the Black Panther Party of the United States of America that led to many threats that the Algerians refused to yield to. But today, as we speak, Algeria is a major producer of both natural gas and petroleum. And with the boycott of Russian natural gas, petroleum, and energy sources, this puts a premium on that energy source from Algeria. And so Algeria, they have diplomats all over the world. They can read the newspapers. They know what you and I know. And they know that they can play off Italy against Spain, which is what they've been doing in terms of exporting their energy. So once again, I don't think that these North Atlantic diplomats have really thought through the implications of what's going on in the world right now. But on the other hand, what this should remind us of is that they may have some sort of dastardly diabolical plan in mind whereby they're going to dramatically shift the global correlation of forces by threatening a suicide pact, which would be a kind of nuclear confrontation. But it's up to us on this side of the Atlantic in particular to halt those maniacs from executing their insane plans.
And I think what the U.S. is seeing now is the formerly colonized are refusing to kneel to the former colonizer. These white supremacists are confused. And I say that because Kamala Harris goes still operating in the mindset of white supremacy. And it's one thing if she had even recognized, to your point, the history that you just so clearly articulated, but it's also another thing that history continues, because there have been, 9 coups or attempted coups, most of them fomented by AFRICOM in 6 African countries over the last 2 years. So they're still trying to play the same game.
Oh, most definitely. And speaking of playing the same game, you need look no further than the unsteady relations between the United States and Zimbabwe. Recall my comments of a few moments ago, where the United States opened the door for thousands of Euro-American mercenaries to descend upon that Southern African nation to try to stymie and stultify independence. Well, as you also know, the United States has stiff sanctions on Zimbabwe because of Zimbabwe's land reform that sought to reverse the ill fruits of settler colonialism. But now they're reconsidering. Why are they reconsidering? Not necessarily because they have failed in their plan to oust the ruling party, speaking of ZANU-PF. According to the current issue of The Economist, the British conservative weekly, they're concerned because Zimbabwe is a storehouse of lithium, which is essential for the green economy. And Zimbabwe is shipping most of its lithium, guess where? Guess what? To the People's Republic of China. And so Washington and his allies are reconsidering their plans, but I dare say that their reconsideration won't necessarily lead to them digging their grubby little paws into the mineral storehouse that is Zimbabwe.
Algeria says no to foreign intervention in Sahara region's war on terror.
Well, obviously that's the case, but because we know that, Algeria is not far distant from Libya, and that part of Africa is still suffering the devastating impact of what befell that North African nation when, under President Obama, NATO unleashed a campaign to oust the leader, which has turned that African nation into a charnel house, whereby not only has slavery re-arrived on those shores, but also Africans by the hundreds, if not thousands, are drowning in the choppy waters of the Mediterranean, bordering Tripoli, as they seek to escape to North and Southern Europe, particularly Italy, where they can have the dishonor of being cheap labor, and worse, being harassed in the streets, as we know that Italy is now under the administration of a neo-fascist government, speaking of Prime Minister Meloni. And what people in the United States need to understand is that this kind of neo-fascism that the United States has sponsored all over the world, it may even be coming back to haunt us on these shores if we are not careful. And this is a special appeal to those who would be the first victims of neo-fascism on these shores, that is to say, the population of African descent. We need regime change in terms of the leadership of our organizations, the leadership politically in Congress, in state houses, in state legislatures, city council. Otherwise, a dire fate indeed awaits.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.